Well, good evening. Well, hopefully everyone has fared well, including friends and families, after this crazy week that we've had with tornadoes and the impacts of Hurricane Florence. My name is Lisa Butler, and I proudly serve on the board of Needles Eye Ministry. And on behalf of the board and the staff, I'd like to offer a heartfelt welcome to everyone here. With the many things that you could have chosen to do on a Friday evening, we are excited and appreciative that you chose to spend the evening with us. And for those of you who aren't exactly sure what you signed up for, let me assure you that you are in for a treat. You know, we live in a culture where it's not uncommon to compartmentalize our work life from our spiritual life. It can be difficult to apply our ideals, our Christian ideals, which are often very black and white, to the world of business and free markets, which can easily get us into the gray. But tonight, with the help of Dr. Ken Barnes, we have an opportunity to begin looking at the perils and the promises of capitalism from a uniquely evangelical Christian perspective. So get excited. But before we get started with our evening, please join me in a word of prayer. Dear Heavenly Father, as I look around this room, I am inspired and encouraged to see so many talented men and women from the marketplace who are also people of faith. We have come here seeking understanding, and we ask that you would prepare our hearts and minds to receive your wisdom through Dr. Barnes's words. We are grateful for this beautiful venue, the hospitality of the staff, and the hands that have prepared this wonderful meal that we're about to enjoy. May this food nourish us so that we can continue to work in such a way that reflects your love, justice, courage, and moderation for the common good of all. In Jesus' name we pray. Amen.
Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. Please feel free to keep eating, but I would ask for your attention as I have the opportunity to thank a couple people and give us some brief instructions about the evening. My name is Jordan Maroon. I work for Needles Eye Ministries as Director of Small Groups and Operations. The inherent vice of capitalism is the unequal sharing of blessings. The inherent virtue of socialism is the equal sharing of miseries. So said Mr. Winston Churchill, never one to mince words. We're here this evening to talk about the extraordinary benefits of capitalism that we are thrilled to enjoy, and also some of the vices and the challenges that we must face and overcome if indeed it is to be redeemed. And so we're thrilled that you joined us, and we think that you're really going to benefit greatly from our speakers this evening. So I'm going to offer some thank yous, and then I'll introduce our executive director, and we'll move forward with the program. First and foremost, I want to thank Dr. Ken Barnes and Barry Duvall, our speakers for the evening, for offering their time and their insight and their experience. Why don't we give them a warm thank you? We're very thankful to our generous gold and silver sponsors and friends of Needles Eye who made this event possible. We're thankful to Dr. Barnes' employers, the Gordon Conwell Theological Seminary and the Mockler Center for Faith and Ethics in the Workplace who made Ken available to travel from the Boston area down to be with us today. And in the bag that was in the seat as you entered and sat down, you're going to find a number of things from our sponsors. You'll also find a copy of Ken's book, Redeeming Capitalism. And at the end of the evening, you'll also have the opportunity out through these doors if you want to purchase additional copies, or perhaps you'll have the opportunity to ask Ken to further personalize the book if you so choose. We're really thankful to the staff of the Jefferson and Jimmy Harris. They're always wonderful to work with. Really appreciate you all that are in the room and those who are helping us right now. Yeah. Thank you to Kate Winston, who's our photographer tonight, and James Lee, wherever he is, who's our videographer tonight. We really appreciate them. And I want to say a thank you to my colleagues, the Needles Eye staff, who work tirelessly to make this happen. They've done a great job, and yeah. And finally, I really want to thank those of you for whom this is your first Needles Eye event. and you're kind of taking a risk, come to see what we're all about. Thank you for coming and seeing who we are. We think that you'll really enjoy this. You know, earlier this evening during the reception, some of us, my wife and I, and some friends were standing and talking, and Dr. Barnes, who's going to be speaking to us in a minute, came forward to talk to us, and everyone introduced themselves, and about a minute into the conversation, my wife said, "Wait a minute, you're Ken Barnes, you're a big deal." And if that's, I thought that was going to be funnier to you all, but it wasn't. Okay, that's fine. If that's you, if you're thinking, you know, I've heard so many great things like my wife had about this Dr. Barnes or about Barry Duvall, and I guess I'll come hear them, I really want to tell you you're in for a treat. I had the opportunity to hear both Barry and Ken speak within the last 12 months and have always learned a lot from these gentlemen, and I'm just thrilled that we have the opportunity to do that this evening. So thank you for coming and being with us. If you invited friends or colleagues, we really appreciate that as well. And so now, as our founder and president and executive director, Buddy Childress, comes forward, I want to draw your attention real quickly to the response card that's in the middle of your program. So right in the middle of your program, there's a response card. And at the end of the evening, Buddy is going to draw your attention back to that card. So I just don't want you to lose track of it. Make sure you know where that is. You may even want to start filling it out here in the next couple minutes. And I'm also going to mention that we will have a Q&A segment, as you might imagine, later in the evening with both Barry and Ken. So if questions come to mind as they're speaking, you may want to jot those down. There's actually a notes page within your program where you could take a couple notes. There's some pins within the bag from some of our sponsors as well. So I'm going to turn things over to our executive director, Buddy Childress, but thank you all so much for being with us.
Good job, man. Thank you. Thank you, Jordan. I want to also add my appreciation and gratitude to our sponsors, certainly to our team. Jimmy Harris, are you anywhere around here? Well, staff of the Jefferson, please pass along my appreciation to Jimmy and to all of you as well. Also want to acknowledge the fact that Congressman David Bratt is with us. David, thank you for being here tonight. And the reason I introduced him was not because he's a congressman, but he's a former faculty member at my alma mater at Randolph-Macon. Stop it, Doug. Got a lot of Hampton-Sydney guys here tonight. So let me begin my introduction this way of my dear friend Ken Barnes, and I need to get that light on. You can read a very impressive bio on both of our speakers in the program, so I'm not going to mention many of those things. I might mention one or two. I will also mention that I need Jimmy Harris to fix this light. Hopefully it'll get straight soon. But I want to add a couple of personal notes to my introduction. So let me begin with regard to Ken by asking you if you've ever known anyone who has a 25-year experience with multi-billion-dollar corporations at the top level of business as an executive, senior executive, and have at the same time 3 masters and a doctorate in theology. Raise your hand if you know anyone like that. This is what this gentleman has done. He holds the chair, the Michael Phillips Professorship of Workplace Theology and Business Ethics at my seminary, Gordon Conwell. He's also director of the Mockler Center for Faith and Ethics in the workplace at Gordon Conwell. Ken has lived in Central Virginia for a period of a couple years back in the 90s. When he came to Richmond, I had a call from the school, and they said, we have a student, a business guy, who's taken a master's degree. He's coming to Richmond. Can you do 2 things for him? Can you get him plugged in with a business that can provide him an internship for his dissertation? And can you tell him where to live? Sure. So Ken calls me. I think we had coffee. And so we got to the conversation. Well, buddy, where do you think I should live? I said, Ken, I can answer that for you right now. And his wife was working in Northern Virginia, went into D.C. a lot, and he was going to be in Richmond. So I told him this. I said, Ken, you do not want to live 1 foot north of Fredericksburg. And that's where he landed, right in Fredericksburg. And apparently it was a good experience for him. When you read the book, and I hope you all will soon, I think you will agree with what I'm about to say. I don't think I know anyone who has the command of 4 disciplines like Ken Barnes: business, economics, history, and theology. I caught myself, and Laura heard me more than once, reading the book and saying, I cannot believe he's tying this together. His command of these disciplines is incredible, which makes the book rich, but also brings me to the point that I'm so excited about because of necessity and the timeliness of what we're about to hear and where we are in our culture. Personally, this is a personal belief, and I sincerely believe this. I think that what Ken has to say in Redeeming Capitalism more than likely is one of the primary principles of God's answer to the incivility and division within our culture today. I really believe that. And as you listen to him and as you read the book, I think you'll begin to see it as well. This is a timely message from a man who absolutely loves Christ, loves his word, knows and probably forgets more about business than some of us have had to deal with over the last week or month or year. And I think he is here in Richmond. I am so thankful to have him here. And I think he's written this book for such a time as this. So, ladies and gentlemen, would you help me welcome Dr. Ken Barnes?
Well, good evening. It is a joy to be here. Thank you so much, Buddy. I could go on about my friendship with Buddy. I won't. If we have time together one-on-one or tomorrow, those of you who come to the conference, I'll be happy to tell you how much I love this guy and how I'm in awe at what he's done in just over 40 years here in Richmond. I want to thank him. I want to thank Jordan and the rest of the Needle's Eye team. And I want to thank Gordon Conwell for allowing me to be here. I've got cousins and in-laws here that came to visit as well. Thank you so much for coming. But mostly I want to thank all of you for taking time out on a Friday night. I am sure somewhere there's a college football game being played tonight that some of you would rather be watching than being here. So I want to thank all of you for coming. I'm really looking forward to what Barry has to say because Barry read the book. And I say that because for the last few months, I've done a lot of radio interviews and recently did a nationwide television interview, but I was with my agent and we were driving the day of the TV interview, and he asked me, he said, so how are you enjoying these radio interviews? And I said, I'll be honest with you. I said, it's really frustrating when they don't read the book. And he said, well, how do you know whether or not they read the book? And I say, if the first question is, so Ken, was Jesus a socialist? I know they haven't read the book. So we got to the TV station, and this host, a very well-known national figure, came up to me in the green room and said, I love what you're doing. This is the most important message you could. I'm so happy you're here. This is great. We get in the studio, I get introduced, and he says, so Ken, Jesus was a socialist, wasn't he? And I thought, he didn't read the book. So I hope you get a chance to read it. I've been blessed with some wonderful reviews from Publishers Weekly and Christianity Today and some other publications. But I got to go back to Oxford, where I taught for many years at Oxford University this summer, and they had a Redeeming Capitalism conference. And I was embarrassed, frankly, by how wonderful these senior economists and theologians and business people were, what they were saying about the book. And I turned to a colleague and I said, I feel like I'm at my own funeral. And she said, your kids probably won't be this nice. But perhaps the most interesting review I read about the book was on Amazon, because a guy said, Ken Barnes started to write a very good book. And then I make a passing reference to the effect on the environment of economic activity, and he said, he's clearly a European liberal in disguise. And I thought, how could he hear my French accent through that book? I just didn't understand. But the real question, as Buddy said, is this a timely book? That's the question I had to ask myself. Is this a timely book to talk about redeeming capitalism? And I thought it was. And then 2 days ago, the president said on national TV, and I quote, "We have the strongest economy ever." And I thought, who knew? The strongest economy. Then I thought, he does have a bit of a proclivity for exaggeration. So maybe it's not the greatest economy ever. So maybe the book is still timely. But there's an awful lot about the economy that is good. And we need to celebrate those things. But here's the problem. When you get into a discussion about the health of the economy, what matters most really is what metrics are you using to measure it. So for instance, if I said to you, hey, how would you like to invest in the stock of a company that has had 55 consecutive weeks of profits, they're the fourth largest in their industry, they're a multi-billion-dollar concern, would you like to invest in that company? You might say, yeah, 55 consecutive weeks of profits, absolutely. And that was the case with Lehman Brothers right before they went bust. Their P&L account looked great, but their balance sheet had a problem. Or if I said to you, hey, I heard you work for this company, and they have unprecedented sales, profits, acquisitions. They're the leader in their field. Everybody's talking about it. You should take all of your pension plan, and you should convert your entire pension plan to that company's stock. Would you do it? At Enron, a lot of people did. The P&L account looked great, but there was a big problem with the balance sheet. And so when we talk about economics and how the economy is doing, remember that it's good that the GDP is growing. It's good that unemployment is low. But GDP is a little bit like our P&L account. And we have to be honest about what's happening to the balance sheet. The growth that we've experienced in the last year, largely the result of a tax cut, has added about $500 billion to our economy. That's good news. However, we're staring down the barrel of $1 trillion deficit. That would be like the CEO of a company saying, hey everybody, I added $500 million to our P&L account. Pay no attention to the fact that I took $1 billion off the balance sheet. And this administration is not the first to do it. I'm sure not picking on this administration. If you look at what has happened to the American economy since 2008, since the global financial crisis, we have added $4 trillion to the gross domestic product, but we have taken $14 trillion off the balance sheet through national debt and quantitative easing. That is a fact that we can't ignore. It gets even worse when you look at the long-term history. I'm about to host a conference at Bretton Woods, the site of the famous Bretton Woods meeting in 1944, where the world decided how it was going to conduct business after World War II. At that time, the United States was the world's largest creditor nation. And listen to this. We possessed 3/4 of the entire world's monetary gold. And the whole world was on the gold standard. Today, we are the world's largest debtor nation. And all the gold in Fort Knox would only pay the interest on our national debt for 6 months. So, that, in my opinion, is a problem. And it's part of a bigger problem. Because when we think about capitalism, we go into our tribes. And it's as though you either are pro-capitalist or you're anti-capitalist, when in fact economics is much more complex than that. I tell people economics is a little bit like whack-a-mole. You do something over here and something pops up over here. We got to be a little bit more pragmatic, because as someone who spent his life creating wealth, remember, I'm a capitalist. The title of the book is Redeeming Capitalism, Not Replacing Capitalism. I want to make that clear. But I'm also a little bit of a poacher turned gamekeeper, because I saw the good of capitalism when I traveled all over the world and built factories and built businesses and employed people. But I also saw the bad and the ugly of capitalism. So when we talk about the good of capitalism, let's celebrate the good. The fact that throughout history, since the era of capitalism began, wealth globally has grown at twice the rate of population growth. That's because of capitalism. There was just an article yesterday in the Wall Street Journal that less than 1 billion people, for the first time since 1990, less than 1 billion people on this planet live on less than $2 a day. We've reduced global poverty by 72% because of capitalism. And by every material measure, longevity, health care, education, arts, sciences, you name it, life is better because of capitalism. And we should never be ashamed or afraid to make that claim. But we also can't ignore the bad. Because while we have less than 1 billion people on $2 a day, we still have hundreds of millions of people on less than $2 a day. While we've reduced poverty by 72% since 1990, in that same period of time, the number of billionaires has increased by 2,000%. And that concentration of wealth is a serious concern. Don't take my word for it. Plato spoke against it. The Tao spoke against it. The Old Testament prophets spoke against it. Jesus spoke against it. We have to be honest about these anomalies in our system. And then the ugly is very ugly. The corporate scandals, I mentioned already Lehman Brothers and Enron, I could go on, Volkswagen, Rolls-Royce, the LIBOR scandal, I mean, they are legion. And what happens is people see those things and they start to ask hard questions about this system we believe in. And of course, the debt and trade wars and greed generally. And here's the thing that we have to overcome. Here's the myth I want to dispel. There is a very common myth, especially among those of us who love capitalism and believe in capitalism. And that is that the bad and the ugly is simply the price we pay for the good. Nonsense. Here's why. When I was writing this book, I came to a very, very important conclusion about capitalism. If you don't remember anything else I say tonight, remember this. Capitalism is a subject, not an object. Capitalism is a subject, not an object. It doesn't possess what we call hypostasis in the theological world. There is no personality trait endemic to it. It's not an artificial construct. There is no central agency behind it. Capitalism is nothing more than the cumulative effect of countless individual and corporate choices made in a system that is highly monetized, lightly regulated, and built on free markets. That's all capitalism is. That means two things. One, it doesn't have a moral compass of its own. It will reflect the morality and the ethics, or the lack thereof, of the cultures in which it operates. And the second is this. The capitalism we have is the capitalism we've chosen. If we want a more virtuous form of capitalism, if we want a capitalism with all of the wealth creation possibilities of the capitalism we have, but without the excesses, without the scandals, without the inequalities that bring shame on it, not because we expect equality across the board, we don't. Inequality is a natural part of the system. But when inequality becomes the hyper-concentration of wealth, and working people aren't able to get ahead because wages and things of that nature aren't keeping up in inflation, we hurt ourselves. And in the book I talk about how Adam Smith, of all people, warned us. And he said, if you want good capitalism, make sure that the people at the bottom are getting more than just what it takes to survive. And Adam Smith, by the way, was writing from the UK. And you know what he pointed to as his example? Capitalism in America. He said to the people in the UK, look at the way Americans do capitalism. They do it right. He said because Americans are willing to take a little bit less in profits to ensure that everybody in the channel participates fully. And it's good economic sense. Why? Because all the boats rise with the tide, and you're creating your own future customers. And you won't have the cynicism that you have today. This is the single greatest threat to capitalism today. It's cynicism about it. Harvard recently did a study. 19% of millennials self-identify as capitalist. 58% say they would prefer to live in a socialist country. Let me tell you something. If we don't redeem capitalism, we're going to hate what replaces it. So, in the book, I look at 3 epochs, and I ask, how do we get here? The first epoch is the traditional capitalism that Adam Smith observed, and guess what? It was built on an Enlightenment version of Judeo-Christian values. And here's a shock to a lot of people. Unless you're an economist, you might not know this. Economics has not always been a mathematical modeling science. For most of history, it was a social science. In fact, it was a moral science. Adam Smith was a moral philosopher. His first work, Moral Sentiments, sets the ground rules for wealth of nations. And then there was another era, unique to America, that Max Weber wrote about, called the era of the Protestant ethic. In the late 19th, earliest 20th century, America was doing better than the rest of the world economically. And you know why? Because it was rooted in this kind of neo-puritanical view of life. And he called it this worldly asceticism of Calvinism. And he said, these people don't believe in compartmentalizing their lives. These people are like the Dutch theologian, Abraham Kuyper, who said, there is not 1 square inch in all of creation over which Christ is sovereign that he does not claim mine. And so the industrialists of that era didn't believe the purpose of a business was just to make as much money as possible. They believed the purpose of a business was to glorify God and to provide human flourishing around them. That's why so much of the philanthropy that we still enjoy today, Carnegie Foundation and others, were built in that period. But Max Weber was quite prescient. And Max Weber said, if America ever loses its moral groundings in 2 or 3 generations, you will have a very different kind of capitalism. You will have an economic engine that creates wealth, but without any moral constraint. He was right. That's the third epoch I describe in the book, and I call it postmodern capitalism. I call it postmodern because it is devoid of a moral compass and resistant, if not impervious, to ethical constraint. And it is that capitalism that the millennials look at and they say, well, maybe something else is better. Well, in the book, I have a whole chapter on Karl Marx and another whole chapter on Bernie Sanders and other people who think like Bernie Sanders, in which I say, look, the utopian solutions don't work. The utopian solutions are fool's gold. But we still have to fix the system we have, or it will turn on us. And here's the good news. We can do it. We can do it. Even though we don't have the religious hegemony they may have had in previous generations, we can do it because we have 3 tools at our disposal that we can use in this project of redeeming capitalism. 1, common grace. God is sovereign of all, even sovereign over those people who don't know it. And God has created us all in his image. And if God wants human flourishing, all we have to do is to harmonize the imago Dei with the missio Dei, the image of God with the mission of God. And we can do it even if we live in a postmodern, post-Christian society. Why? Because we have something else that is common to all human beings, and that is an innate knowledge of virtue. People know the difference between right or wrong. We didn't need the 10 Commandments to tell us not to kill our neighbors. People know. And here's the thing about virtue. It's out of fashion because we have bought into the ethical egoism of all that matters is looking after me. All that matters is what's good for me is good. And that is directly opposite from what we believe to be true as Christians. So we can bring prudence and courage and justice and temperance back into economics because everybody knows in their heart of hearts that we need them. And we have something else that we claim as our own. We call them the theological virtues, but guess what? They're just as common as the other virtues. And we call them faith, hope, and love. So the rally cry of my book is, people of faith, use your faith. Bring your faith into the marketplace. Show people that you are different than the world. Show people that you do not buy into this ethical egoism. Because guess what? Economics can't work without faith. Our monetary system is a faith-based system. Make no mistake about it. That piece of paper in your pocket with a picture of a dead president, it's just a piece of paper. But you have faith that it will get you goods and services if you present it. And what does faith do? Faith breeds hope. And again, we can't have a capitalist system without hope, because why do people invest? Why do people take risk with their assets? In the hope that they'll get a return. And when I talk to millennials, you know what they say to me? We don't have any hope in capitalism. We don't have any faith in capitalism. We're saddled with debt. After going to college, we were told we'd get a good job and we'd be successful, and we're working at McDonald's 3 years after graduation. And we still are saddled with debt. But we notice that a lot of people are making a lot of money. It ain't us. We need to bring hope. And the only way to do that is by exercising that last and most important virtue. Love. Love. We need to bring love back into capitalism. And love is not the mawkish emotion on greeting cards. That's not the love I'm talking about. We as Christians know how the Bible defines love. And it's not with a word, it's with a symbol. And that symbol is the cross. The greatest act of love ever. Because love is about selflessness. It's about the great loving the needy. So, as I say at the very end of the book, it's a can-do book, not a how-to book. I do have 2 chapters on how to redeem capitalism from the bottom up and the top down. You have to come to the conference tomorrow if you want that. But here's the really good news. Not only, that's my timer, and I'm just about to wrap up, so I did that right. Here's the good news. There is no quick fix, but we didn't get here quickly. So this is more of a mission than a project. It's more of a journey than a destination. It really is not, my book is not a manifesto for a movement. It's a credo for a community of people who refuse to believe that God is incapable of redeeming this thing called capitalism. And that's why I wrote the book. To invite you all on that journey out of the desert of postmodern capitalism into the promised land of redeemed, virtuous capitalism. Thank you.
So our next speaker and responder to Ken is a dear friend. And before I begin to introduce him, let me say that once Barry has finished his remarks, we're going to do some Q&A. All three of us will be up here, so be thinking of your questions. And I think that should be a very lively and a very intriguing time. Barry Duvall came with the Virginia Chamber of Commerce in 2010. At the time, they had approximately 1,000 members. Today, they have 26,000, and it is the largest business advocacy group in the state. Barry was actually mayor of Newport News from 1990 to 1996. He began his tenure at the age of 19. Obviously, you'll know that when he comes up here. That was also, Jordan, this isn't a funny crowd tonight. No one's hearing our jokes well. Between 1998 and 2002, he served as Secretary of Commerce and Trade for the Commonwealth. He is married to Cindy, who is a CPA. She's also a teaching director for Community Bible Study. They have 3 grown children, Catherine, Daniel, and Rachel, and spouses, and they're all at that table right there. Thank you for being with us tonight. I have been in a small group with Barry for about 5 years. I know him personally. I know his love for Christ. I know his commitment to the authority of Scripture for his life. He is a renowned and an astute businessman and an encourager of business people. He's strategic in his thinking, and he's very committed to his Lord. I can't think of a better person to be our second speaker tonight. Would you help me, ladies and gentlemen, welcome the CEO of the Virginia Chamber of Commerce, Barry Duvall.
Well, thank you, Buddy, for allowing me to be here and share this time with my family. Thank you, ladies and gentlemen, for being here tonight on a Friday night. And it's a pleasure. And Dr. Barnes, thank you for being here. Thank you for writing the book. I noticed that Dr. Barnes pulled his timer out. I'm going to pull mine out. It sort of reminds me, I was raised Independent Baptist, and I took a friend with me once to church when I was a young boy, and my pastor pulled his wristwatch off and put it on the counter in a similar way. And my friend said, so what does that mean? And I said, absolutely nothing. But I actually am going to kind of keep track of time. Buddy told me I could really speak as long as I wanted, but we were starting the panel in 15 minutes. So I was honored to be asked to give this response. When Buddy called me, I said, Buddy, I know Ken, and I had a chance to meet him a year or so ago, and I said, he's got more degrees than a thermostat. He is a very bright individual. He studied business and economics. He's a theologian. He's an economist, and I'm not sure I'm the right person to give that response. I don't have that many degrees. I'm not a theologian. In fact, I'm in the 12-step recovery program as a recovering politician. See, Buddy, they're laughing. They're with me. It's the quality. No. So Buddy said, no, that's exactly, I want you to do this. And I have been in a small group with him and others in the room, and I'm really honored to be here. I think we are some of the most fortunate people on the planet. Those of us who are sitting in this room tonight. And I think we're some of the most fortunate people in the history of mankind, for those of us sitting in this room tonight. We have the privilege of calling ourselves Americans. And we have the honor, in my view, of calling ourselves Virginians. And if you weren't born here, but you moved here, like my son-in-law from England, who married my daughter last year, we're adopting him as well as a Virginian. Virginia has a lot to be proud of. We are the birthplace of democracy. We are the cradle of democracy. It all started right here in Virginia. And we are the envy even today as a commonwealth of many states around this country. We have been nationally ranked as one of the best states to do business. And I regularly have a chance to speak about the economic profile of the Commonwealth. I won't do that tonight. Our unemployment rate is 3.1%. We're moving in the right direction, need to create a few more higher paying jobs, but we're a very blessed Commonwealth. We're seeing the Commonwealth grow right now. And I think it will continue to grow, and I think our best days are ahead as a state. But I would tell you that we really grow in Virginia around economic boundaries. When I was a young mayor, the president of the shipyard invited me to come to his office after about 30 days of being a mayor. I'd never been in the shipyard. I was 30 years old. He said, "Congratulations on being elected mayor. We have 30,000 people employed at the shipyard. Over the next 6 years, we're probably going to lay off 10,000, and we're going to have about 20,000 people by the time I think you finish your political career." And I remember right then thinking, this is a pivotal moment in my life. And I started to read and research and talk to other mayors and form a mayor's group and started saying, look, this isn't a Newport News problem, this is a Hampton Roads problem. And I learned in my 30s that Virginia really grows and prospers around economic boundaries. So for those of us who are in Central Virginia, for those of you who call Central Virginia your home, it's just as important what happens in Richmond as Hanover and Chesterfield and Henrico and Powhatan, because this region's going to grow and prosper together or it's going to fall away together. And this region has all the key elements. Dr. Rosabeth Moss Kanter, a business professor at Harvard Business School, wrote a book in 1996 called World Class. She studied all the regions in the country that were growing and prospering. They all have a few things in common. They all have transportation that allows people to move back and forth quickly. I mean, Richmond has 2 interstates, multiple rail, internet connectivity, an improving airport. They all have institutions of higher education. In fact, there's no region in America growing and prospering that doesn't have a higher education institution. None. Richmond is blessed with institutions of higher education. This region is blessed. They have high intellectual capacity, which means how many masters and PhDs do you have? This region is blessed with that. And they have a workforce that can produce and manufacture in technical schools. This region is blessed with that. And I would say many other regions have that, but what this region has and what our Commonwealth has that many others do not is pro-business legislators. I see Jimmy Massey here, one of the most outstanding pro-business legislators we've had. Dave Bratton was here earlier. Again, Republicans and Democrats in Virginia, governors on both sides of the aisle, very pro-business. So we're blessed to be a Virginian. We're blessed to be in Virginia, and I think our greatest days are ahead. And I will tell you this about being an American. You know, we are 10 days on the other side of the 17th year where we have recognized the attacks of 9/11. I know where I was on 9/11. Can you think about where you were? Take a minute and think about it. I was driving to Washington, D.C. I got a call from my wife. And she was telling me what was happening as she was watching it on television. I turned around and I drove back to Richmond and I went to my office at the Capitol. I was the Secretary of Commerce and Trade for the Commonwealth of Virginia. And I remember watching those buildings. And here's what I remember the most. I remember thinking we are being attacked because of our values. We're being attacked because of our faith. We're being attacked because we're mostly a Christian nation, but we also believe in the freedom of religion. We're being attacked because we defend people in Israel and believe in the Judeo-Christian relationship. We're under attack because of our values. That's why we're under attack. And here's what else I remember. I remember learning what a first responder was. I don't think I'd ever really focused on that term until then. And I remember thinking, as I watched those buildings burning, and I saw what was happening and the hundreds and hundreds of people that were running from those buildings, I remember those people that were running towards the buildings. Do you remember who they were? They were first responders, weren't they? And why were they running towards those buildings? Because they had a heart for the people in those buildings. They had received the technical training to go in there, but they had a heart for those people. And they wanted to go and help those people. They saw the need, and their response was to go help. It's because of what was in their heart to go help. Do you know there were 2,977 people that died that day? 417 were first responders. And I think about how they responded because of what was in their heart. And I'm really encouraged about this book. As Dr. Barnes, and I'll summarize with a couple of points. As Dr. Barnes, if you get, and it's a great book, chapter 13, this is what he says about capitalism, if you don't mind me quoting you. He says, capitalism reflects cultural values. If we want a different kind of capitalism, we need to begin to change the social, political, theological, ethical drivers that have formed our economic system. He goes on to say, we cannot do this simply by changing the laws that govern our economic activities. Capitalism can only be changed through the wholesale change of human hearts. Amen to that. That's what they would say in my Baptist church growing up. It's only the wholesale change of human hearts. And I think about that, and I think those first responders, they were trained to go towards the trouble. They were trained to see those in need, and in their hearts was the passion to do it. And I will tell you, while we have a lot of prosperity in Virginia, and especially in Central Virginia, we have a lot of people in need. And we have a lot of communities in need. And that was true when I was mayor. And if we get a chance to talk later, I can tell you a story about how to motivate the faith-based community to make a difference. And with all due respect, I think what's in our heart is really what matters the most to God. And I think when I think about God's creation of mankind, with his foreknowledge of our failures, with his foreknowledge of the fall and my belief in the Bible story, he knew that we would struggle with our humanity. And when I think about the plan of salvation, and with all due respect to the economists in the room, and you've probably heard something along these lines, but if God thought solving man's problems was going to be an economic system, he would have probably sent an economist. If God thought solving man's problems was through further education, he probably would have sent us an educator and a professor. And I think if God thought solving man's problems was a result of our political system, he would have sent us really a politician, right? But our problems really are the same throughout human history. Our problems are problems of the human heart. And so he sent us a Savior. And he sent us a Savior to be the bridge between us and him so that we could have the opportunity as individuals to walk in a new path inspired by God and as a result do his work. And I would just say the application in my life is this. I was very fortunate as a young man to have that faith opportunity presented to me, and I asked for my sins to be forgiven, and I asked God to come into my life. And I think from that point on, God was present in my life. And maybe you've done that, and God is present in your life. But what I realized is that I needed God to be prominent in my life, and I needed him to be more than present. I was pleased that my name was written in the Lamb's Book of Life. I was pleased that on that second coming, I would be taken up to heaven. But really, I needed more than that. I needed God to be prominent in my heart. And by being prominent in my heart, I knew I would ask him who I should marry, and he led me to Cindy. I knew I would ask him what career I should take, and he led me into politics, and thankfully led me out, buddy. But I would tell you, I'm still in the recovery program. And I would check in with God on the big things. And maybe some of you do that. Someone is sick, someone is in need, someone needs a job. I would check in with big things. But to me, I need to choose every day for God to be preeminent in my life. That's what I need to choose. And I need to wake up every day. And because he made me like him, and because he made you like him, he gave you free will. God is free to choose and free to create, just like he's given you freedoms every day. So for me, the application is to choose God every day to be preeminent in my life. And I think if I can do that and others can do that, and especially if we're in a position where we can share our prosperity with those in need, we have a great opportunity to really change our culture. We have an opportunity to make a difference in our workplace. We have an opportunity to show his love through us to others. And I think it's one life at a time. I think it's one person at a time. And then God uses those people and he puts them in position. And as a result, we have an opportunity to transform a person, a family, a community, a company, and people's lives. And I think if we would follow the path of putting God as preeminent in our lives and preeminent in our heart, then our response to the human need will be his response. And we can talk more about that. But working together with his help will create a brighter future for the people of this region and Virginia, and I think America. Thank you for allowing me to be with you tonight.
So we're going to have a couple of runners with microphones. And I know it always takes the first question to get these things going, so somebody needs to be brave. You should have, there you go, right there, guys. So who would ask the first question of our speakers tonight relative to what you've heard or what you may think you heard? And let me see a hand, and we have Jordan over here and Karen over there. So who would like to ask the first question? This is going to be really rich once we get started. Down here, front row, Hader. They're really getting you tonight, man.
So first, I want to thank you guys for coming down here and talking to us. Dr. Barnes, a great speech. Mr. Duvall, thank you for everything you're doing in our community. The question I had was, thinking about the folks who are promulgating the utopian answer or other answers to other systems, is that an indication of a desire to try to redeem capitalism without an understanding of maybe Christ or what the issues are? And if so, is it not happening because the church is not providing an adequate answer and giving something that's appealing? And if that's the case, I know there's multiple layered, what can we do in the Richmond business community to provide that answer?
Great question. Great question. I say in the book that we defer to regulation and legislation when ethics fail. And I think one of the reasons why ethics are failing is because the church has been asleep at the switch. We have really not accepted the mantle of responsibility that belongs to us as the guardians of these ethical principles. When we talk about the virtues, the church didn't invent the virtues, but we have been the guardians of them here in the West for centuries. And I think we have forgotten that an important part of our ministry is to teach that. And the first part of your question, why do I think people seek utopian solutions? I think they seek utopian solutions primarily because they want a quick fix to a slow problem. And as I mentioned in the book, I have a whole chapter on Karl Marx. I think I'm very fair to Marx because what Marx observed was horrifying. And he tried to come up with a solution. But it was a really bad solution because he didn't understand economics. So I think we should respect those people who say, well, let's try something new. But we also need to warn them that the pitfalls and the dangers and the unintended consequences of going down that road is much worse than if we would simply redeem the system we have by changing hearts.
I think just to build on what Dr. Barnes said, if you think about American politics over the many centuries, in the 1960s, President Johnson brought us a war on poverty. Remember that. We started moving towards public housing, public food stamps. I think the United States government began to move into an area where the church should have been. And perhaps because the church wasn't, therefore there was a void, and we began this war on poverty. We still have poverty in America. We have a lot of public housing projects in America. I know as a mayor in Newport News, we had 180,000 people. We had 70,000 households. 7,000 were on public assistance, 1 out of 10. And we had to go into neighborhoods and actually tear down old, dilapidated public housing and give those people housing vouchers so they can go out and choose where they wanted to live. And as we began to do that, it actually began to reduce some crime. But America's government has had a war on poverty, and in many ways, some of the deficits are a result of American government stepping in and trying to provide food, shelter, clothing, and the like. But clearly, I think there's an opportunity for the church to do more, and the business community through its prosperity, which is still very generous, and many of you in this room I know are extremely generous, but for the broader community to think about how to organize and approach the challenges of the region a little more effectively.
If I could just follow up. Historically, by the way, what you observed is exactly what happened in Europe with Marxism. When did Marx write his book? It was during the Industrial Revolution, and the church was not only absent, the church had colluded with the industrial powers. And that void had to be filled by something. There's an old expression, nature abhors a vacuum. And a vacuum of faith, hope, and love had been created. And Marx filled it, and people went for it. And the damage was devastating.
Thank you, gentlemen. Next question. Hand, please. Back in the back. Jordan? Tim?
Dr. Barnes, I have not read your book. And so with that said, and I did invite my nephew tonight, who is a millennial, who declined. Was Jesus a socialist? Kind of a plant.
Well, since you predicated it by saying you hadn't read the book, I'll give you a pass on that. No, Jesus wasn't a socialist, but he also wasn't a capitalist. And as I explain in the book, these terms, they just lose their meaning when we try to project them onto past eras. They just mean nothing. So when you do get a chance to read the book, and I hope it's soon because you have a copy there, you'll see I trace, if you will, the history of economics and the relationship between religion and economics throughout those various epochs. And while you can't say that Jesus was a socialist or a capitalist or anything else, what you can say is that consistently throughout the Bible, those who have wealth are commanded to use it according to the precepts of God's law and God's will and God's heart. So to whom much is given, much is expected. That you can't escape. But any talk about the Bible says that we should be socialist or capitalist or any other ist is just wrong. Good question, though.
Next person.
Hi, I have a question. Thank you all so much for everything you've said. And Mr. Barnes, I really look forward to reading your book. I'm excited we have a copy here. My question, so forgive me if I misunderstand and please clarify. I'm hearing you say that our country's wealth comes primarily from capitalism and that was built from a moral compass and a moral place. I'm curious what you would say about that in terms of the fact that our country was built on slavery and free and forced labor, and what you would say from a capitalist Christian perspective is the solution for us moving forward in that.
Hopefully both answer this, but let me just say, that slavery was an aberration, and slavery was a very bad economic system, not to mention an immoral system generally and socially corrosive. When the British outlawed slavery in 1811, do you know who they appealed to in their arguments on the floor of the Parliament? They appealed to Adam Smith. Because the pro-slavery people were saying, take away our slavery and you take away our economics. And they said, no, 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 no. Adam Smith is telling you, if you really want a healthy economic system, everybody who's part of it has got to flourish. And that is the opposite of slavery. So not only is it morally wrong, it's economically stupid. So I don't believe that America was, quote unquote, built on that system. I believe that system held us back several generations. It wasn't until after we ended slavery and the economic system of modern capitalism that I talked about, that Max Weber observed, kicked in, that we really saw wealth creation in the United States. But it's a very good question.
Next, Lee.
Ken, you talked about the first void in the early part of the 20th century. We know that there's a second void coming with a lot of the stuff happening with artificial intelligence. What does that void look like if we don't, as the church, step up and address it?
So I have the privilege of working with Massachusetts Institute of Technology and Harvard Business School on these very questions of what is the impact going to be economically of artificial intelligence and robotics coming together. The general consensus is it will be more disruptive than the first industrial revolution, which is why the politics of this are so important. Because folks, if we stay in our tribes, we're not going to be able to solve these problems. These problems are huge. They are monumental, they are endemic, and they will require all the best brains in the room to figure it out. And it's going to require cooperation between the public sector and the private sector, starting with the church, to figure out how we construct an economic system that doesn't allow artificial intelligence and robotics to become a bad master when they should be a good servant. So the answer to your question is we don't know. We only know that there are a lot of different possibilities coming at us. But I can promise you, if we don't start working together on these things across party lines, we are dooming ourselves, because these problems are much bigger than ideology. Ideology is like a cancer when you're trying to talk about the kind of change and disruption we're facing, in my humble opinion.
Thank you. Lee, next question. It's a good conversation. Let's keep it going. Back in the back, Karen.
Dr. Barnes, thank you, and God bless you all up there. You said cynicism is the biggest threat to I agree with you wholeheartedly. I think it's the biggest threat to our way of life right now. What's the first step to eliminate that, to turn that around, in your opinion?
So, what is cynicism? Cynicism is really just a lack of faith in institutions. That's all it is. That's why I talk so much in the book about the requirement for bringing faith back into our discourse. For believers, it starts with faith in God. But even for non-believers, there has to be faith in things bigger than ourselves and things outside ourselves. A lot has been written recently about the post-truth era that we're in. We're in a post-truth era because we're in a post-faith era. People no longer have faith in the source of information, so they just don't believe it. And they defer to conspiracy theories and all kinds of things because they've lost faith in those fundamental institutions that built this country. So that's how we start to change it, is by changing the narrative and saying we need to bring faith back in to the formula. Faith, if you're a believer, in God. But even if you're not, faith in the things that are fundamental, institutional to our way of life. And that means faith in government, and there's a terrible dearth of that. It means faith in the press, there's a dearth of that. But also, faith in ourselves, and in each other, and in our neighbors. You know, my parents grew up during the Depression, the Great Depression. And they would tell stories about how people came together, people who had nothing, and found a way to be happy. And you know, it reminds me of the fishes and loaves. Because those were little miracles every time those neighbors got together. And that's the kind of thing the church, in my opinion, should be at the vanguard of. We should be modeling that. So that's the way to break cynicism, in my humble opinion.
We have time for maybe 2 more questions. So who would be first of the 2? Gerald.
Thank you. Hi, Dr. Barnes, Mr. Duvall. A question that I have is that how can we make, or at least work towards people being more inclusive? All right. The dilemma that we have in our country, Crystal had spoken on it earlier about slavery. Unfortunately, we had another period. The Reconstruction period was a positive period. And then we went into Jim Crow. And then we went into, and also within that period, you had peonage. All right. And so, unfortunately, historically, our country has not been at least a country that looked favorably towards everybody. All right. And I guess the level of greed that spewed into our country and into our economic system caused, in many instances, people to pit against themselves. All right. And I guess for myself, just moving forward, I mean, there's been a lot of progress in our country, but there's just so much of a divide, okay? The divide of, like you said, you have the wealthy, and then you have the people that are poor, all right? And like you said, everybody's grabbing for straws for a solution, all right? The cost of education is outrageous, all right? There are just so many things now that as a country, we have to work towards trying to pull things together. You know, unfortunately, I guess I'm not in favor of the administration that we have now. I think, unfortunately, we have someone that's driving people apart, pitting people against each other, okay? And in fact, the next person that will take over has a major job in trying to bring us back together. Right? And so I guess I challenge you just with the question of how can we change things, all right? Things that Buddy and I talk about is that we have a more inclusive group. We just look at our group here, okay? If you look at the people that are here that look like me, all right, very few, all right? And so how can we take steps so that we do the right thing in the future? There's so many terrible things that have happened just in the 20th century. The level of exploitation, the level of just people taking advantage of others. How can we as Christians really make a dent to make the difference to really help others? All right? Because there's so much of a problem that we're all dealing with. And so that's why a lot of people struggle with capitalism, socialism. I agree with you. I agree that capitalism is a very positive answer for us all. But how do we work together? How do we do business with each other? All right. How do we do the kinds of things that make it so everybody wins in the total solution?
Thank you. An excellent question, and you make a lot of good points. In the book, I talk about the problem of discrimination and the tragedy of it, not only on social terms and moral terms, but also in economic terms. One of the issues we have, for instance, if you want to look at a practical thing, is access to capital in communities that are regularly blocked from having access to capital. Now that's something we can change, and it's something that the people in this room can help change. We did a project in Boston through Gordon Conwell Seminary where we raised venture capital to go into the Roxbury neighborhood of Boston and sponsor businesses that were being started by local people in that community who otherwise could not have gotten any capital to start those businesses. And most of those businesses are still operating. This is what I mean when I talk about love. Jesus Christ died for all of us. And if we aren't willing to reach across those aisles, to reach across those boundaries of color and race, religion, let me tell you what, and I say this in the book, what group has suffered the most discrimination in recent years in this country is 51% of the population, women. And the church has been one of the most egregious violators, in my opinion. So we have got to grow up. And we've got to start treating each other the way Jesus Christ treats us. And if we can do that, I believe we can move the needle. And I think we have to.
Just to add to what he was saying, and just maybe from a practical perspective, for what I see is that the business community has responsibility to lead on this issue. And I think an inclusive business community is important. A lot of business people individually get involved in initiatives. The great equalizer, in my view, is education. And what I've seen in the last 10 years is that the business community is focused on early childhood education in a way that I've never seen before. Politically, some of you may know early childhood education used to be sort of a synonym for socialism, and they're going to take over your children and they want to babysit them and control them. But what has really become reality for business people is that they know in order to have a workforce 20 years from now, they have to start with early childhood education. And business leaders across the Commonwealth have come together, formed an early childhood education foundation. Tom is one of the great leaders of that. And they understand the great equalizer will be the opportunity to focus on early childhood education. And I'd love to see the business community do more in that area. Tom, I know I see your head nodding. Thank you for your leadership on that. But many businesses know what product they need to produce. They know how to finance the product. But they don't know where the workforce is going to come from. And I think the economic prosperity and the education will be the most liberating opportunity. So I'd like to see us work with the business community across all communities to make sure they have access to early childhood education. I think 20 years from now, this community will be whatever its workforce allows it to be. And if we don't get that right 20 years from now, this community won't be as prosperous as it is today. So we have to get that right for the next 20 years.
Thank you, gentlemen. One last question, and then we'll have some final comments. Who would ask that? Val? Down here. Val, hold your hand up, please. There you go.
Thank you, gentlemen, for all your wisdom tonight. You've talked about the hope of redeeming capitalism requiring really the reshaping of individuals ethically and perhaps of communities being reshaped ethically. And you haven't spoken at all about the entertainment industry, which is shaping and forming a lot of our nation's ethics, in a sense. I wonder if that's something you've given consideration to and how the church might play a part in that.
So it's a great question, and we in America have allowed our culture to move away from heroes in what traditionally has been fields of heroes, and we often worship entertainers. And if you just look at the economic model, what we pay entertainers based upon what they do to perform compared to what others get paid, it's just a tiered system that represents how much we value entertainers. In return, though, entertainers become opinion leaders. And those entertainers, I don't just mean that produce television, I think it's those that provide athletic entertainment as well, because they're entertainers too. So our athletes, our sports arenas, those who operate in them, and those who play in them, and those who entertain us, are all opinion leaders in our society, maybe in other societies as well. What I would hope the church will do is, and I know there are some churches doing this, and I know there's some Christian leaders in America doing this, is reaching those individuals one person at a time. Because I think it's got to be their hearts changing in order for them to create a message of faith, hope, and love and inclusiveness. But I think that is such a great question, because our entertainers in America do establish the values that we often see lived out throughout all generations. Thank you for the insight.
No, I can't do better than that. Thank you.
Let's thank our panelists, huh?